I have here two very early Jaques Staunton pattern chess sets, and I want to discuss how one identifies the date on these sets. I'm thinking that this is 1860 to 1865, and this set is earlier, 1853 to 1855. Now, the dating of Jaques, there's been much written about the dating of Jaques Staunton pattern sets, and most of the identifying of sets tends to focus on the knights. And Professor Sir Alan First, in his excellent book, has bought a number of, or collected together a number of sets in boxes which have dedications and dates on and names, and you can be reasonably sure from those sets that the date is correct. However, when you find some set in a junk shop or in an auction, how do you go about deciding whether it's this period or that? Now, the early knights varied from set to set, and sometimes this drop jaw style was produced for some early sets, and sometimes it was this style of knight with the very craggy looking face and long nose, which is very similar to the knight which was on the actual registration document. So we're calling this the registration document knight. This set's had a number of restorations, and I had to make two knights for it, but I think I made a reasonably good attempt at them. Now, there are other differences, and if we take, say, a king from each set, for example, and I can keep these sets differentiated because one's weighted and one isn't. The earlier set is much restored and weighted, 3.5 inch. The later set is hardly any restorations at all, was almost perfect and is unweighted. So, let's look at the kings. These early sets had relatively small crosses on the kings. The stamp was a curved stamp, and that seems to have been in use pretty well from the start. They had a flat stamp which they used on the bottom of the ivory sets, but for these curved bases certainly they had a curved stamp. And we know the stamps were separate, Jaques on one stamp and London on the other, because we've very occasionally seen sets with Jaques or London, and sometimes Jaques London. However, so these are differences between the kings. The weighted set has a slightly more slender stem on the king, and otherwise virtually identical. You could probably substitute one in this, if one wasn't weighted and one not, you could probably substitute one in the set and never notice. Base size is the same diameter, so we wonder sometimes, because of the problems with the knights changing so much in style, whether or not it was because they used subcontract carvers, and that's something which we will probably never know. We have only a very unreliable comment made by Bertram Jones that Jaques turners turned and the carvers carved, and a document from the Ayres factory which was written by a newspaper man who said that the carver there carved 48 knights sets a day using the carving on the lathe method, and that's quite possibly true. However, it's just one source. Now let's look at the bishops. So again, the bishops, very similar, slightly more slender on the stem, not quite as wide on the head, and this has a slightly better shape to it to my eye. Again, very similar, not very much difference in there. You could almost think it was just a slight difference in, given that these could be 12 years apart, just the different turners. And presumably when they were making these things, they would set up to make them with a profile of some sort, or a sample, and they would make a wooden block with some nails through, which they would touch on the spinning flattened wood, or rounded wood, and it would give them all the different places to give them a measure of whether, so they could make them all. So they came out all pretty well identical. You know, in each set, so you would expect the thickness on this to do vary a little bit. I mean, that stem's a little bit thinner than that stem, for example. So they vary a tiny little bit. So obviously they were just dropping the calipers on, and if it went a bit thinner, they didn't bother too much about that. But they've got a nice big flared top, and I think there's usually 11 points. 10 points on this, sometimes 10. There's sometimes I've seen them with 11, I'm sure. And let's have a look at the pawns. So there's not a lot to choose, frankly, between these two sets. I mean, the pawns, ball's slightly bigger on this one, stem slightly thicker. There isn't, you would notice it if you had an odd pawn in the set, you would certainly notice that although the pawns are the same height, with this one's got a bigger ball, the collar's slightly lower down. So let's get to the knights. Well, certainly there were at least two different drop jaw knights, and here we have one from this set and another odd singleton that we had. And we call these drop jaws for the obvious reason. Sometimes called laughing knights, but the drop jaw seems a better appellation. Got this very stumpy nosed one. So was it just the fact that these knights were put out to subcontractors, or in fact did they have different carvers that carved them? But you can see there's definitely a much shorter stumpy nose on that one. This is, you know, much better looking as far as the proportions for a horse are concerned. This is one of the much later knights, 1915, 1920, and a lot of these are very similar, and I think a lot of the difference, apparent differences in style, are just that different carvers were carving to the same pattern, and it wasn't a deliberate style change. But one would assume that it's going from this to this, there would have been some sort of discussion at management level, or Jaques just didn't care. We will never know, because even if Jaques do, they're certainly not telling anybody. So you get the chance to pick your knights, really. And here's, in Professor Sir Alan Fair's book, his page about the Elgin marbles. Now, the Elgin marbles came from the Parthenon in Greece, and they're called the Elgin marbles because Lord Elgin was the one who brought them across. So there's the knight from the registration document, and Professor Sir Alan Fair pairs it with a drop jaw. It doesn't look very similar, to be fair, I have to say that, but then the others really do. Looks as if the Jaques were making some attempt to represent, as they said at the time, it was produced in the Times and no doubt in the ILN, the London Illustrated News, that the knights' heads were supposed to be very beautiful and taken from these Elgin bas-relief carvings, which were very popular at the time and much talked about in the press. So here we have it, two sets, both 3.5 inch, one weighted very early, 1853 to 1856. Much restored, I have to say, on about the limits of what you can do for restoration. And this set, hardly any damage, now restored, but a little bit of damage it had, I think, just three tiny bits of damage. Slightly later, still fairly early and fairly rare, 1860 to 1865. Nice looking set, all original felts, every piece is the same felt. Some of the felts are a little bit scuffed, but can't be helped. And a nice, very attractive looking drop jaw knight. And it's the kind of choice that Jaques chess collectors have to make all the time, whether or not to buy a set. Do you go for the earlier set with the registration document knight, or do you go for a later set, slightly later set, still quite rare, with the fairly attractive, I think very attractive drop jaw style. Thank you.